You ever stand on the edge of something so perfect, so goddamn serene, that you forget for a moment that the world knows how to destroy things? Because that was me 6 months ago, standing barefoot on my back lawn, watching the mist rise off Cedar Hollow Lake like breath from a sleeping giant. I had a mug of black coffee in one hand, a fishing rod leaning against my porch railing, and not a worry in the world heavier than whether the bass would bite before the sun burned the fog off. That lake, my lake, or at least half of it, shimmered with the kind of untouched beauty you don't find on postcards, because no photographer could capture what it felt like to live beside something alive. You could watch herons stalk their breakfast along the shallows, their slow movements elegant like a ballerina warming up before a show. The cypress trees stood like old sentries, roots tangled in the water like arthritic fingers clutching secrets. Every ripple on that surface was a memory in the making, a skipped stone, a child's laugh, the flash of silver from a fish breaking the mirror. And now, that lake's gone, drained dry like it was nothing more than a decorative puddle. A graveyard for fish, frogs, and whatever piece of my soul had quietly sunk into it over the last year. Somewhere in the cracked mud, beneath the glint of broken reeds and tire tracks from unmarked trucks, lie the remains of what I once called peace. So what happened? How the hell did I go from retired lawyer, living a quiet lakeside dream, to dragging an entire HOA board into federal court and watching half of them end up in handcuffs? That's what you're wondering, right? Well, let me take you back to the beginning. I spent 30 years fighting in courtrooms where the lights never felt like real daylight and the air always smelled like printer toner and cologne. 30 years defending clients who lied better than they spoke truth. I climbed my way up through depositions, settlements, last-minute objections, and champagne toasts that tasted like burnt ambition. And when I finally made enough money to walk away, I didn't want a yacht or a penthouse. I wanted a dock. A cheap, creaky, weathered dock that I could sit on with a tackle box and forget how many hours I had wasted arguing about clause definitions in insurance litigation. Cedar Hollow Lake wasn't even on a map unless you zoomed in so close that the labels started to flicker. That's how I knew it was the right place. The house I bought sat on a gentle slope, with a porch that faced east, so the sunrise didn't just light up the yard. It poured in like an unspoken blessing every damn morning. The deed was clear. The lake was divided, my half on the eastern side, theirs on the west. The HOA controlled the rest, neat sidewalks, the pool, the newsletter about which mailbox was too colorful last month. I didn't mind. I wasn't there to make waves. Ironically, at first, things were neighborly. Fish fries on weekends, paper plates sagging with hush puppies and catfish fillets. Kids came over to learn how to clean a trout, wide-eyed as I showed them the entrails, pretending not to flinch when they touched the guts. I was that strange but friendly guy with a law degree and a good fillet knife, and I liked it that way. No pretensions. No clients. Just water and sunlight and second chances. But paradise has rules, and rules attract the kinds of people who worship power more than peace. It started with emails, syrupy sweet things signed warmly the Cedar Hollow HOA board, which is basically suburban code for you're pissing someone off. The first one mentioned concerns over my use of the dock. Another warned about unpermitted environmental activities, which apparently meant fishing. It was the kind of language that sounds polite until you've seen it enough times to know it's a loaded gun dressed in khakis and HOA stationery. Still, I kept calm. The bylaws explicitly listed fishing as a permitted recreational activity. I had receipts, property lines, and legal jargon that would make their heads spin. I figured reason would win. It always had, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in every conference call where someone tried to bluff their way past the fine print. But Cedar Hollow wasn't built on reason. It was built on landscaping budgets, board member egos, and a pathological fear of nonconformity. I should have seen the signs. The way Linda Bowman, the HOA president, stopped waving back. How other neighbors started driving slower past my house, as if trying to catch me committing a crime of aesthetics. But I told myself I was overthinking it, that all the creeping tension was just growing pains. Then came the morning, everything changed. I was up early, coffee in hand, headed out to push my John boat into the calm morning mist. But what I heard wasn't birdsong or cicadas. It was machines. The kind of guttural, grinding noise that makes your stomach twist before your brain catches up. Diesel pumps, massive, industrial ones, roaring on the western shore like mechanical beasts. Black smoke curled into the air. Hoses, thick as fire snakes, snaked across lawns into waiting tanker trucks. I watched the waterline drop in real time. 1 inch. 2. The lake hissed and sighed as it sank, like it knew it was dying. I ran barefoot through wet grass, recording everything. Time-stamped. Narrated. I had learned long ago, when someone's trying to erase something, you document faster than they can lie. And there she was, Linda Bowman, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her face like a cartoon villain too lazy to pretend. I asked her what the hell she thought she was doing. She smiled like she'd been waiting her whole life to say, mosquito control. When I pointed out that she was draining my property, not just hers, she shrugged and said the board voted. Just like that. No permits. No warning. No science. Just a vote. Like they were choosing between salad dressings instead of gutting a living ecosystem. That was the moment I knew I wasn't dealing with neighbors anymore. I was dealing with tyrants. I stood there, camera still recording, feet in the mud, heart racing. All the serenity I'd built, every morning of peace, and every child I'd taught to cast a line gone. Replaced by arrogance. Replaced by Linda. And I realized in that gut-punched clarity that only comes when you're betrayed by something you trusted. I wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. So I ask again, where do you enter this story? At the muddy edge of a drained lake, watching the fish die gasping in the sun? Or further back, at the moment the first email came in, cloaked in politeness but barbed with intent? Maybe you recognize this battle. Maybe your own slice of paradise has its own Linda Bowman. Maybe you already know. It only takes one person with just enough power and no accountability to ruin everything. And maybe, just maybe, you're here because you want to know what happened next. Good. Because it gets worse before it gets better. But I promise you, it gets better. The night before the pumps arrived, the lake had been a sheet of glass under a full moon, so still I could see the silhouette of a deer drinking on the opposite bank, its reflection clearer than its body. The kind of silence you don't hear, but feel, deep in your ribs like nature holding its breath. I remember sleeping unusually well that night, no dreams, just the dense, black velvet of true rest. And then, the next morning, all that was gone. The pumps didn't just wake me up, they violated the silence. They shredded it with the sharp-toothed rhythm of machines that weren't meant to be in a place like this. But what haunted me more wasn't the sound. It was the coordination. Those diesel beasts hadn't just shown up on a whim. Someone had made calls. Contracts had been signed. Trucks arranged. Crews dispatched in the dead of night. This wasn't negligence. This was premeditated. As I filmed the hoses, I noticed metal tags bolted onto the pumps. I zoomed in and noted the manufacturer and contractor name, Ramstead Environmental Services. A quick search on my phone revealed they specialized in wetland management and controlled drainage systems. Their tagline made my stomach twist, where nature meets vision. Vision apparently meant erasure. Linda wasn't alone either. Flanking her were two board members I hadn't seen at the fish fries. One was Greg Alston, vice president, clean cut, suit energy even in a windbreaker. The other was Susan Myers, treasurer, clipboard in hand, looking like she was conducting a census of destruction. I called out across the shrinking lake. You filed permits for this? Greg answered, not even facing me. You're trespassing on HOA business, he said flatly. Susan scribbled something down without looking up. My fingers were shaking, not from fear but rage, the kind that simmers low and slow, like water about to boil. I turned and walked back toward my house, mind already racing. It wasn't about fish anymore. It was about precedent. Because if they could erase a lake with a secret vote and a few trucks, then nothing was sacred. Your trees, your view, your peace, all expendable for the right community initiative. I called Harold. He answered on the first ring, his voice hoarse and uncertain. They did it, I said. It's happening now. There was silence, and then, I tried to stop them. Brought it up at the advisory meeting. They shut me down, said it was above my pay grade. Harold had served as the unofficial historian of Cedar Hollow. The guy who knew who built what, who used to own that corner house, and what used to grow where the tennis courts now sat. He had also seen the neighborhood morph from quiet retreat into a curated suburb with an HOA that acted more like a private regime. They never posted an agenda, I said. They wanted no paper trail. Check the landscaping budget, Harold replied quietly. Bet you'll find the reason under renovation plans. That's exactly what I did. I sat down at my desk, opened the community portal, and scrolled through PDFs until my eyes ached. Buried deep in a quarterly report was a line item labeled Phase 1, Aesthetic Optimization Lower Reservoir Redevelopment. No further explanation. No breakdown. Just a $72,500 allocation approved 2 weeks prior. I printed it. Highlighted it. Filed it. Evidence. Meanwhile, the lake dropped another 6 inches. I spent the afternoon driving into the county office, not emailing, not calling, because I knew those could be intercepted, ignored, delayed. I wanted a paper trail. At the Environmental Control Division, I met with a woman named Tessa Morales, a sharp-eyed clerk who raised an eyebrow when I showed her my deed and photos. They didn't file a mosquito control permit, she confirmed after checking. And they're within 300 feet of a protected wetland buffer. And the drainage? I asked. They file anything on that? She shook her head. Nothing. And by the looks of it, they're displacing habitat, which is a whole other department. She handed me a form. File a preliminary complaint. We'll flag it. I left copies of everything. Drove straight to the library and printed more. Photos of dead fish, timestamps, contractor quotes from Ramsted's public site. Every detail, no matter how small, was filed, dated, and labeled. I was building a case. Not for court. Not yet. But for truth. Back home, the pumps were still going. A faint chemical smell hung in the air, diesel mixed with rotting algae and stirred mud. That night, I heard the frogs go silent. The crickets too. Just the low, relentless hum of human arrogance. At 2:14 a.m., I received an anonymous text. No name. Just a message. Check HOA email archives. They knew. Attached was a screenshot, an email chain between board members, one of which featured Linda writing, "Let's just do it fast. If we delay, someone will file a complaint. They always do." I stared at it, heart pounding. That was intent. Not mistake. Not oversight. Intent. The next morning, I made copies, then drove to the local field office for the State Department of Environmental Protection. I asked for a meeting. They told me to wait. I did. For 3 hours. Then a man in a brown windbreaker with a badge clipped to his belt invited me into a back room and asked me to start from the top. I did. I told him everything. The lake. The split ownership. The pumps. The endangered species I suspected might be there. He took notes. Asked for physical evidence. I handed him the envelope. He didn't open it right away. Just stared at the cover, then looked up and said, "If you're right, this isn't a zoning dispute. This is federal." I didn't nod. I already knew. That same day, a squad car showed up on my property. No lights, no sirens. Just a silent silhouette parked on the gravel by my dock. The officer stepped out and started taking photos, same angles I had. Then came the second car, this one marked FWS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. 2 agents stepped out, both wearing sunglasses, both carrying equipment cases. They didn't speak much, just started working. And it hit me, this was real now. No longer my word against Linda's. No longer just a man with a camera yelling across a dying lake. This was documented. Filed. Escalating. By sundown, the HOA posted their first statement, a bland press release taped to the community bulletin board, written in corporate speak. The Cedar Hollow Board affirms that all lake management activities are in alignment with community values and mosquito prevention protocols. No names. No accountability. No mention of permits. Just passive voice and empty reassurance. That night, the wind changed. A storm was coming. You could feel it in the way the air thickened, in how the trees tilted slightly eastward. But the real storm had already started. And they didn't see it coming. They still thought I was just some lonely old man with a fishing rod and too much time on his hands. They thought wrong. The smell hit me before I stepped outside, the dense, sour mix of evaporated algae, sun-baked fish, and motor oil. You don't forget a smell like that. It doesn't just creep into your nose. It clings to your skin, follows you inside, haunts your furniture. The pumps had finally stopped, not because anyone had ordered it, but because there was simply nothing left to take. The lake, or what used to be the lake, had become a basin of cracked mud and shallow, steaming puddles. Herons were gone. So were the dragonflies. The cypress trees at the water's edge stood exposed now, roots dry and curling like the fingers of the dead. I stepped down into what had once been a shoreline and squatted beside one of the deeper pockets of water. Inside it, fish swirled in a panic, dozens of them trapped, gasping, colliding into one another as the oxygen dwindled. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. I didn't have a plan, not really. Just instinct in buckets. I started scooping what I could, bass, minnows, even a terrified turtle that clawed at my hands. I worked for hours, shirt soaked through, mud up to my knees, dragging every salvageable creature to the shaded side of the property, where an old rain barrel still held clean water. I was halfway through another run when I saw them. Tiny darting shapes barely the size of a fingernail, speckled like someone had dusted them with ash and ink. I froze. It took me a moment to remember the name, Ethiostoma stigmium, speckled darters. I had read about them once in a conservation article years ago, and the memory returned with surgical clarity. Threatened species, habitat-specific, legally protected in the state and federally recognized under the Endangered Species Act. My hands were shaking when I lowered a bucket and gently guided 3 of them inside. I didn't stop to change. I didn't even wipe the mud off my face. I walked into my living room, still dripping, and called the State Department of Environmental Protection. I didn't speak to a receptionist this time. The call got transferred. The man on the other end listened quietly, then asked me to hold. When he returned, his tone was clipped and surgical. Do not disturb the area any further. Secure what you've collected, document everything, and leave the rest untouched. Someone will be dispatched within the hour. And they were. But not just one. By the time the sun crested the treetops, I had counted 2 state SUVs, 1 unmarked sedan, and 3 agents with cameras and sealed coolers stepping through the caked mud like crime scene technicians. One of them introduced herself as Karen Mathis, short, wiry, and moving with the efficiency of someone who didn't waste words or time. I handed her the bucket. She stared down at the tiny fish like she was looking at stolen diamonds. Jesus, she muttered. They killed a protected habitat. She turned to her partner. Call Fish and Wildlife. Now. I stood back, watching them spread out across the lake bed, placing flags, bagging samples, taking measurements. It felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like the early stages of a federal indictment. For the first time in weeks, I felt still. Not calm, never calm again, but grounded like gravity had chosen to take my side. Within 90 minutes, a convoy from U.S. Fish and Wildlife pulled in. Agents in khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses unloaded equipment with clinical precision. One of them took my testimony like a deposition, voice recorder clicking as I detailed every moment from the first email to the last fish. We'll need your original footage, she said. Everything. You'll get it, I replied, along with copies of the emails I've intercepted. Her head tilted slightly. Intercepted? Anonymous source, I clarified. Internal HOA correspondence. You have that on record? Printed. Archived. Annotated. I handed her a folder. She flipped through a few pages, her eyebrows lifting with each one. This is bad for them. That's the idea, I said. I'm done playing nice. Word spread fast. By the following morning, the story had already leaked. Not officially, but enough for a local blogger to run an exposé titled, Cedar Hollow HOA Accused of Environmental Sabotage. It wasn't Pulitzer material, but it did its job. By noon, there were reporters outside the front gate. By 3 p.m., the county sheriff had issued a statement confirming an ongoing investigation into potential environmental violations. And by sundown, someone, probably from the board, retaliated. A bright yellow envelope appeared on my door, taped dead center like a warning shot. Inside, a cease and desist letter from the HOA's legal counsel. It accused me of defamation, unauthorized surveillance, and unlawful interference with HOA projects. It threatened daily fines up to $500 and promised further legal consequences if I continued impeding operational procedures. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was pathetic. I had gone toe-to-toe with multinational insurance firms. This was amateur hour. I filed the letter away in a binder labeled Cedar Hollow, Evidence and Retaliation. I added timestamps, photos of the envelope, and cross-referenced it with footage showing board members walking across my property line during the pumping operation. Let them sue me. Discovery would be biblical. That night, my phone pinged again. Another anonymous email, routed through a secure server. This time, it was a full thread of board emails. Jokes. Mockery. References to the fish as lake bugs. Linda herself had written, think of it this way, no more slimy surprises for the kids. She ended it with a smiley face emoji. I didn't reply. I forwarded the thread to Karen Mathis and Fish and Wildlife with the subject line, intent to destroy protected ecosystem. Then I printed it, highlighted key phrases, and slid it into the growing file. Within 24 hours, things escalated again. Reporters now staked out the HOA office. Environmental groups launched online petitions. The Change.org page reached 20,000 signatures by dinner. Someone spray-painted Save the Lake on the community tennis courts. Cars honked when they passed my house, some in support, some with middle fingers pressed to windows. I didn't wave back. I stayed focused. Filing. Documenting. Responding only when it mattered. The board doubled down, hosting an emergency HOA meeting that excluded me entirely. Held on a night they knew I had a scheduled interview with state investigators. Flyers appeared accusing me of inciting hostility and jeopardizing property values. I kept every single one. I had them laminated. 2 neighbors I used to fish with now wouldn't meet my eyes. But Harold? Harold stood by me. He brought me receipts, literal receipts, copies of landscaping purchases the board had approved weeks before the pumps arrived. Grading equipment, water redirection materials, all hidden under the label, routine maintenance. They were planning this from the beginning, he said. They were just waiting for the weather to be dry enough to avoid runoff issues. I stared at the receipts. Dates, vendor names, signatures, all board approved. They buried this, I said. They thought no one would look close enough. They didn't count on you, Harold replied. They never do. That night, I slept with my window open, letting the sour wind drift in like a warning. The lake was gone. But justice was rising like a tide. The pressure didn't break them at first, it bent them slowly like heat curling a strip of metal. The HOA board still showed up in their pressed polos and stiff postures, smiling tightly at passing neighbors like nothing was wrong, like there weren't news vans parked half a block away or camera lenses aimed at their front doors. But something had shifted. You could see it in their eyes, in the way Linda Bowman's gaze darted a little too quickly between faces at meetings, or how Greg Alston started arriving with a briefcase clasped so tight his knuckles went white. Power, I've learned, doesn't vanish overnight. It corrodes, from the inside out. And by the end of that week, the corrosion had started to show. It began with the landscaper. Carlos Ramirez, owner of Green Horizons, the company hired to do the so-called mosquito abatement, gave a press interview on the steps of the county courthouse. He didn't even flinch when the cameras rolled. "I was hired to drain a lake," he said flatly. "No one mentioned endangered species. No one filed permits. I have the texts." And then he read them, line by line. Texts from Linda telling him to drain it fast and don't ask too many questions. Another from Greg said, "If you do your part clean, we'll take care of any blowback." But the one that hit hardest? A message from Susan Myers. "We'll call it mosquito control if anyone asks. Stick to the script." The reporters ate it up like blood in the water. Ramirez even printed the screenshots, handing them out to press and investigators like party favors. "I got a copy too, laminated it, filed it." But that day wasn't about evidence, it was about momentum. For the first time, someone besides me was willing to throw the board under the bus, and he brought receipts. That night, the board's carefully scripted PR narrative collapsed like wet cardboard. The next morning, a new letter showed up at my door. Not a cease and desist this time, an invitation. The HOA was hosting a community discussion forum regarding lake maintenance and restoration efforts. I almost laughed. A discussion. As if what they'd done could be rebranded as an unfortunate landscaping choice. But I didn't ignore it. I dressed in a dark blazer, brought 3 printed binders, one labeled legal violations, another community impact, and a third simply lies. And I didn't go alone. I had called in Rebecca Hastings, an environmental attorney I'd worked with on a corporate compliance case years ago. She was razor smart, cool-tempered, and had the kind of courtroom presence that made even seasoned litigators rethink their strategy. When she stepped into the meeting that night, her heels clicked across the community hall floor, like a metronome counting down a symphony of consequences. The place was packed. Neighbors who hadn't said a word to me in months now leaned in, whispering nervously. Some looked scared. Others looked pissed. Linda stood at the front in her signature white polo, flanked by Greg and Susan, all 3 of them looking like hostages forced to smile. "We want to open with some thoughts on stewardship and safety," Linda began, her voice trembling just slightly. "This lake, while beloved, posed an unmanaged threat to the health of the community," Rebecca interrupted with surgical calm. "Before you proceed, my client would like to introduce some materials into the record." She stepped forward and handed Linda a packet thicker than a Bible. "Inside you'll find documentation of unauthorized drainage, evidence of endangered species habitat destruction, correspondence from your contractors, and a timeline of regulatory violations. Copies have been sent to the state DEP, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the local district court." You could hear the silence break like glass. Linda fumbled the packet. Susan went pale. Greg stared straight ahead like if he didn't blink, he could time travel out of the room. And then Rebecca leaned in and smiled, not warmly, but with the kind of precision that says, "I came here to bury you in facts and watch you dig the hole yourself." "Further discussion is inadvisable," she added, "given the likelihood of pending charges." The rest of the meeting dissolved into chaos. One neighbor stood up and shouted, "You drained our lake for what? A walking path." Another held up a petition demanding immediate board resignation. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The evidence was speaking louder than I ever could. When the meeting ended, half the room stayed behind, not to talk to the board but to talk to me. Parents whose kids used to fish off my dock. Retirees who had quietly watched everything unfold behind drawn curtains. Even the barista from the corner coffee shop showed up to shake my hand. It wasn't vindication. Not yet. But it was something. And Linda? She didn't stay to shake hands. She left through a side door flanked by Greg and Susan, their footsteps fast and clipped, like cowards exiting a burning house. Over the next few days, the collapse accelerated. First, the HOA's insurance company issued a letter announcing it would no longer cover any legal fees related to the incident, citing intentional misconduct exclusions in their policy. That meant the board members were now personally liable for everything. Then the resignation started. Barry Hastings, the HOA treasurer, stepped down citing mental health stressors. Translation: he knew the subpoenas were coming. A day later, Susan resigned too. Greg held out until the end of the week, but when it became public that the state attorney general's office had opened a criminal inquiry, even he couldn't fake composure anymore. Linda, though, refused. She dug in, doubled down, held a press conference from her driveway, flanked by 2 attorneys in wrinkled suits, blaming misinformation and personal vendettas for the fallout. She called me a disgruntled retiree with too much time and a grudge against order. I didn't respond. I just released drone footage, recorded weeks ago, of her standing on the drained lake bed, arms crossed, directing pump operators while fish flailed in the mud beside her. That clip made the local news within hours. It went national by morning. And then came the warrants. Federal agents and windbreakers showed up not just at the HOA office, but at Linda's home, Greg's condo, and the storage facility where they thought they had hidden backup files. They seized hard drives, phones, physical documents. Reporters called it the Cedar Hollow Files. I called it justice in progress. And through it all, I stayed steady. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I kept showing up to meetings. I kept restoring what little I could of the lake. I kept meeting with investigators, handing them every document, every timestamp, every name. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. Not just of the ecosystem they tried to erase, but of the trust they shattered in every neighbor they lied to. Linda's arrest came at sunrise. A silent procession of black vehicles. The zip of a handcuff. The distant click of a shutter. And me? I watched from the porch, coffee in hand, not smiling. Just breathing. The first sound that returned was the frogs. It happened slowly, barely noticeable at first, a faint croak in the distance, swallowed by the breeze. But then another. Then three. Then the chorus began again, cautious and staggered like the timid first notes of an orchestra tuning up after a long silence. The pumps were gone. The trucks, the press, the parade of suits and subpoenas had all faded into memory, but the frogs were back. And somehow that made it real. Cedar Hollow had changed. Not in the ways HOA planners once envisioned, with trimmed hedges and sterile tranquility, but in the quiet shift of power, raw, uncomfortable, and overdue. With most of the board either indicted, disgraced, or vanished into retirement under clouds of litigation, the neighborhood held its first honest election in years. Not a formality, not a pre-approved ballot mailed in secrecy, but a real, open election. The kind where people actually showed up with questions, with memories, with a desire to rebuild something real. Harold was elected president unanimously. Nobody even ran against him. The man who once wore a torn fishing hat and muttered warnings in hushed tones now stood at the front of community meetings, sleeves rolled up, voice steady. Elaine from 2 streets over became secretary. She used to be invisible, one of those soft-spoken neighbors who waved from her porch and vanished behind a screen door. Now she typed minutes with a purpose, calling for transparency like a war cry. Even old Mrs. Langston, who had never spoken more than 10 words at any meeting before, took on the role of treasurer. Her first act? A public audit of every dollar spent in the past 5 years. No more secrets. No more renovation phases. The lake, my lake, was no longer a battle site. It was a restoration project. Official, state-sanctioned, community-funded. With clearance from the environmental department and support from regional conservation groups, we began the slow process of bringing it back to life. The first step was earthwork. Volunteers dug shallow trenches to redirect natural spring water back into the basin. We installed aeration systems, not high-tech ones, just solar-powered paddles that churned oxygen into the recovering pools. Then came the replanting, native grasses, reeds, and aquatic plants hand-placed by teams of neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact with me at the mailbox. It was awkward at first, being thanked by people who once called me troublemaker in whispered driveway conversations. But I didn't hold grudges. I didn't have room for them anymore. I gave out gloves, instructions, water bottles. I answered questions. I worked beside them. Because this wasn't about me. It never had been. Rebecca Hastings stayed on, pro bono at this point, helping finalize civil settlements. With Linda and Greg facing federal charges, environmental destruction, fraud, obstruction, our civil suits gained teeth. The HOA's insurance company washed its hands of them months ago. That meant the board members were personally liable for damages. Rebecca filed motions to freeze Linda's assets. A lien was placed on her home, her accounts, even her pension. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. About teaching people like her that power without consequence is a dangerous game. She never looked me in the eye after her arraignment. Didn't have the strength. Or maybe the decency. Either way, her empire was gone. And the community she once lorded over now built memorials out of what she tried to destroy. We commissioned a local artist, a young woman named Josie who had painted murals in nearby towns, to carve a sculpture out of one of the fallen cypress trunks. What she created stunned us all. A fish mid-leap, its body arching through the air as if breaking free from the mud and rot below. Its mouth open, not in fear, but in defiance. Its scales glimmered with embedded glass pieces donated by neighbors, fragments of broken porch lights, cracked mason jars, a shattered wine bottle from the night of Linda's arrest. At the base, she carved 3 words in deep, raw grooves: respect the water. We placed the sculpture at the edge of the newly formed shoreline, where sunlight hit it every morning, and kids now raced barefoot across the banks. On the day of its unveiling, people brought folding chairs and sandwiches. They brought old photos of the lake, stories, apologies. I didn't make a speech. Harold did. He kept it short. We forgot who this place belonged to, he said. Not the board. Not even us. It belonged to itself. And now we remember. That night, I sat alone by the dock. My dock. The one I had almost lost to silence. The water had returned slowly, fed by springs and rain and time. It wasn't deep yet. It wasn't wide. But it was alive. I dipped my hand into the surface and felt minnows brush my fingers. Dragonflies hovered above like living threads of sunlight. Somewhere nearby, a frog let out a triumphant croak, answered by 3 others, then a dozen. The ecosystem was learning to breathe again. And so was I. In the following weeks, something strange happened. People started fishing again, not for food or sport, but for ritual, for connection. Parents brought kids to my dock, asking quietly if they could teach their children what I once taught mine. I said yes. Every time. Because that's how healing works. It ripples. It echoes. It asks you to reopen the door you once locked out of fear. Rebecca and I stayed in touch. Sometimes over calls. Sometimes over lemonade on my porch. She laughed easier now. Less guarded. She told me once, this case? It reminded me why I got into law in the first place. Not to win. But to protect. I think we both needed the reminder. As for me, I didn't rebuild the house. Didn't upgrade. Didn't move. I stayed. Because scars don't mean retreat. They mean memory. One morning months later, I launched my old John boat again. Same creaky hull. Same faded paint. The sun was just crawling over the treetops, casting that familiar honey gold glow across the lake. I poured coffee into a steel mug, leaned back, and let the current drift me out. The water lapped softly. Birds sang. A ripple broke the surface, a fish, bold and hungry, returning home. Somewhere behind me, the courthouse prepared for another pretrial hearing. Linda's lawyer was already preparing for a plea deal. The charges stacked too high to climb. Fraud. Destruction of protected habitat. False filings. It didn't matter how much money she once had. The clock was ticking. But none of that lived here anymore. Not on this water. Not in this moment. I took a sip of coffee, let it settle in my chest, and smiled. Not a smirk, not a gloat, just a quiet, steady smile. Because this lake was still here. The fish were still swimming. The wind still whispered through the cypress trees. And finally, everything was exactly as it should be.